Hello everybody, good afternoon. It's a huge pleasure this afternoon to have this plenary session with our four speakers. Barbara Formis, Monika Kowalska, I hope I am pronouncing well, Rosella Mazaria, and Yemen Drum. Each one is going to present for like 10 minutes, and then we will keep a question and answer for the end of the session. Thank you for being here. So we are starting with Barbara Formis, as you have heard also this morning. She's an Italian philosopher and a full professor of aesthetics, of philosophy, of art and critical theories of culture at the School of Art at the University Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, and the Weber of Art Institute. Her work focuses on the philosophy of the body and the application of pragmatics, aesthetics, and gender studies. The floor is yours, Barbara.
Okay, thank you. Now, I will use this things a lot as a day. So today I would like to evoke how the aesthetic dimension serves as a connective tissue for care, democracy, and also an embodied relation in contemporary digital culture. So just for a quick, for my theoretical framework that is drawn on pragmatic aesthetics, feminist and care theory. This framework allows me, I think, to conceptualize some critiques towards digitalization. What I mean by digitalization is kind of vague, but it's this world of AI and new media. So these critiques serves to examine how relational gestures, both digital and embodied, shape the conditions for cooperativity and political action. That's why I was very interested in asking this question about the conditions this morning, Chinwen. Relational aesthetics that is inspired by theorists such as John Dewey, Wittgenstein, and also Nicolas Bourdieu. Relational aesthetics elucidate how aesthetic experience is not confined merely to beauty or to art, but extends to everyday modes of feeling, attending, and co-creating meaning with others. So is this extension towards the everyday that is interesting for me. And feminist and care theory, on the other side, particularly the work of Tronto and Gaetan, tend to repoliticize the everyday, repoliticize care as a foundational democratic practice rather than a private activity. So there is this real between public and private. So whilst digital technologies can amplify possibilities for collective co-creation, participation, and mutual recognition, they also risk fostering alienation, individualism, and masculinist imaginaries through mechanism of standardization, surveillance, platform-driven isolation. These technologies of the digital world, they also threaten to reduce relationality to passive consumption. And they can promote homogenization through algorithmic filtering and obscure the tactile, multisensory richness that sustain political care. So in view of this complexity, I think that cultivating a democratic embodied aesthetics within digital spaces requires an intentional, reflexive design strategies that foreground pluralism, inclusivity, and participatory engagement. In this theory, I think that the works of Yuriko Saito could be very useful here. Yuriko Saito's theory expands expands the traditional boundaries of aesthetics theory beyond art and privileges aesthetic experiences to include the mundane, routine elements of everyday life. So she criticizes the historic Western-centered, art-based biases in aesthetics, and she advocates for recognizing the aesthetic value in ordinary objects and everyday activities, such as cleaning, repairing, cooking, and all these tedious tasks that need to be done, and that we all do. Saito emphasizes the moral and ethical dimension of everyday aesthetics, noting that aesthetic judgments are often intertwined with ethical considerations, shaping how we relate to our environment and to others. So her approaches draw heavily on Japanese aesthetics and pragmatism and American pragmatism. And she highlights the embodied, action-oriented, and socially embedded nature of any aesthetic experience. So from this, for any actually pragmatist point of view, any object or subject has acquired meaning and value through the use that we do, the people do. So it's very anthropological and mostly human orientated. But I think it's interesting to understand digital tools not as such, but as the use that we make of them in daily activity, and highlighting also the importance of active and context-sensitive engagement that we can have with technology. So here it's very, let's say, still at the part, there can be a good user of technology and a bad one, and somehow the difference between the two is not that clear. As shown by Shaxin Wei and the Topological Media Lab since many years, experimentation and artistic experimentation with digital tools can be used in order to assess risks of passive consumption and algorithmic homogenization, and also fragmented attention or distraction. So we can use them even against what we think that they make us do, these digital tools. So in the digital age, this broad conception of aesthetics extends to how digital forms, interfaces, gestures, and platforms choreograph our everyday perception and relational possibilities. I don't know if you ever had this experience that sometimes you can be in the street and see things as if they are in slow motion, or as if they are kind of filtered by digital images that you are already familiar with. So this perspective invites us to think of digital aesthetics not just as a design or visual style, but as a lived, relational process embedded in daily use and experience. So if the aesthetic experience is often associated with the body, then artificial intelligence calls into question the very meaning of what we understand by body, what we understand by sensation, senses, and the sensible per se. That is kind of this realm of aesthetics. So I think that aesthetic naturalism should not be understood as a binary and antagonistic relationship between body and new technologies. In reality, there is a dynamic two-way relationship between technicality and natural bodily way of living, since digital technology and artificial intelligence are now an integral part of our ordinary life and also of our aesthetic interpretations. Unfortunately, the digital world proves to be oppressive and somehow also ridiculous, like here with entertainment, because many digital platforms are fundamentally structured around values that are traditionally coded as masculine, such as efficiency, competitiveness, supremacy, and control. So the dominant brand narrative surrounding digital technologies often celebrate a masculinistic imagination of the autonomous subject who exercises power. which is a fantasy. Nobody is autonomous, nobody is as powerful. So these underlying symbolic structures tend to marginalize modes of relating that emphasize connection, emotion, and care. In stark contrast, the more visible roles on digital platforms, including developers, leaders, and public influencers, continue to be largely male-dominated. Also, as demonstrated by the works of Kate Crawford, artificial intelligence and algorithmic systems consistently embedded and amplify sexist, masculinistic, and gender-normative biases within the content recommendation, profiling, and moderation processes. Ultimately, they constrain the possibilities for diverse and caring forms of relationality within digital spaces. So this is why digital care is a feminist issue. Digitalization highlights, I don't know if you can actually read, highlights the historical feminization and devaluation of care work, which feminism seeks to repoliticize by recognizing care as foundational to justice. Digitalization also offers transformative possibilities. It enables new forms of solidarity and supports through online mutual aid networks and feminist digital organizing that cross borders and traditional boundaries, such as with the Me Too movement, of course. Feminist digital activism often enacts gestures of care and expressivity that build political and social solidarity and empathy. These can reframe care as collective, embodied, and participatory practice rather than isolated and commodified work. So what I can see here is what counts is not the digitalization or not of the relationship, but is the collective democracy and on the same level sort of relationship. So in conclusion, digital experiences reshape aesthetics, judgment and perception, and also gender balance relationship. Digitalization in general and AI in particular may enhance an active participatory experience, mobilizing sense, thought, and engagement. This perspective calls for critical vigilance, questioning the infrastructure, design choices, and data models underlying AI systems, and envisioning the possibility of a more democratic aesthetics, attentive to relations, context, and plural experiences. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for this insightful talk and being in time. Thank you. Let's welcome our second speaker, Monika Kwasniewska. So, it's to you. You have also 10 to 12 minutes, and for people who get in the hall, meanwhile, we keep the question and answer at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. For several years, my research has focused on institutional critique, especially the abuse of power and violence in theater institutions and artistic processes. In this work, following media reports, I often encounter situations that reveal the limits of institutional procedures and the helplessness of systems that were meant to protect. The first situation appears when those who speak about violence are neurodivergent. Anti-violence procedures are usually written from the neurotypical perspective. Applied to neurodivergent person, they can be ineffective or even harmful. At the same time, neuroatypical behaviors are often judged as inappropriate or excessive, which makes complaints or call-outs even harder. The second and third situations are linked to mental health crises. People who have experienced violence often suffer long-lasting psychological consequences. Their behavior may then seem exaggerated or hysterical, which leads to their complaints being dismissed. On the other hand, there are also cases where a person in mental health crisis becomes the preparator of violence. Their condition cannot excuse the harm they cause, but institutions should respond in ways that stop violence without deepening stigma. Neurodivergence is strongly connected to both mental health and violence. Neurodivergent people often face mental health crises. They tend to be more exposed to manipulation and to violence, and at the same time their unusual behavior are sometimes misinterpreted as inappropriate or rude. In recent years, particularly under the influence of the #MeToo movement, public call-outs in media and social media have become an important tool. They expose violence, not only sexual, and discrimination that were tolerated for years, and they inspire new institutional practices, code of ethics, the coordination of intimacy, anti-discrimination procedures. But call-outs also have their dark side. As Adriana Brown argues in her essay, "We Will Not Cancel Us," calling out can damage whole communities. In cases of misunderstandings, conflicts, or even harm, where dialogue is still possible, Brown argues that transformative justice is a more constructive tool. It doesn't only deal with individual cases, but seek to transform the terms and conditions that allow injustice to happen. For such dialogue and transformation to be possible, we need to take into account that not everyone communicates and experiences reality in the same way. Yet in cultural institutions, anti-discrimination policy rarely address neurodiversity and mental health in details. This gap makes dialogue difficult and often bring cases directly into the sphere of public call-outs. When social media and the media become involved, situations grow even more complicated and often don't serve the survivor's interest. At first, a survivor may gain support from the media community, but this can quickly change as sympathy depends on rhetorical skills and manipulation of emotions in the media. Very often, the person who made call-out ends up portrayed as demanding, unreliable, incompetent, or even insane. This depends feelings of misunderstanding, loneliness, and injustice. Many behavior targeted in public shaming may actually be linked to neurodivergence or a mental health crisis. However, explaining these conditions publicly is difficult and may increase stigmatization. In this short talk, I cannot analyze all cases in depth, so I will focus on my most important observation, mainly concerning neurodiversity. The neurodiversity umbrella includes spectrum of conditions, such as ADD, ADHD, autism spectrum, bipolar disorder, chronic anxiety, or depression, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyslexia, dyspraxia, epilepsy, OCD, PTSD, or Tourette's. Neurodivergent people often spend a great deal of energy masking in order to fit into a neurotypical world. This constant effort to adopt is exhausting, and it shows why institutions should create procedures that are flexible, inclusive, and attentive to different conditions and needs. First of all, they should ensure that no harm comes to anyone to avoid the need of complaints and call-outs. A useful resource Art is an online publication working with neurodivergent artists, a new collective guide for cultural organizations. Created by New Collective, a Scottish community of neurodivergent artists advocating for inclusion in the arts. From my own analysis of public callouts involving neurodivergent individuals, the most important points in this document are: ask about the individuality of artists, name the neurodiversity in organization, bullying and harassment policies, allow the possibility of working with assistants, train staff on the social difficulty of neurodivergent people, creating detailed schedule in accessible format, and regularly checking that they are all understood and implemented by all participants. Write down the unwritten rule of the workplace. Allow flexible working hours, for example, in relation to medication effects. Arguing on the most comfortable form of communication, written, spoken, in person or online. Based on the cases analyzed, I would like to add a few more recommendations worth considering in despite best efforts, harm or conflict occurs. Setting a clear guideline for complaint handling procedures. Neurodivergent people perceive time differently. Explaining the individual steps and the expected duration of each stage help to avoid the impression that the complaint has been ignored. Ensuring access to psychological support and/or an assistance in crisis situation. And perhaps most importantly, treat neurodiversity as a resource. Neurodivergent people often name the others avoid saying. In an environment where violence is normalized, their different perspective and perception of reality can help to deconstruct harmful practices. In such a framework, media and social media could serve not as areas of callouts, but as spaces for self-advocacy, sharing knowledge, giving tools, and networking about neuroatypical artists. This is already happening. An example of this is mentioned above New Collective and the similar workshop and discussion group Neuro of Meanings, founded by Polish visual artist Mateusz Kowalczyk. The meeting of Neuro Meanings group resulted in a collective poetic manifesto available online and addressed to Polish cultural institutions. I see such initiatives as utopian impulses according to theory of Ernst Bloch, Frederick Jason, and Ruth Lelintas that points us for a different future. A future in which care, inclusivity, and transformative justice will be practices that we try to practice in art institutions and in the media and social media that accompany them. They will be a part of our everyday life.
I'm sorry, I'm presenting you at the end of your talk. I'm sorry. So Monika Kazniewska is the editor of the Australian Theatre Journal and author of several books. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Theatre and Drama at the Millennium University. So let's have our third speaker. Thank you, welcome. Rosetta Mazzakilia is an associate professor in performance studies at the University of Bologna. She is the director of high degree courses in artistic
artistic mediation in intercultural context and was primarily co-editor of social practice labs at the summer school in global studies and critical thinking.
Bonjour, good morning everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for Sophia and thanks to Barbara for inviting me. Today I will present some reflections on theater, care, and digital innovation in juvenile detention. Drawing on the case of the Punto Zero company that works at the juvenile penal institution Plenary in Milan. This experience has proved that theater and technology together can open doors, create bridges, and give dignity to young people in detention. But first, a brief note on my theoretical framework, which is in social and community theater, critical, and feminist theories. The primary sources I will be quoting and the images I will show were directly provided by Punto Zero company. However, inmate names will be thoroughly anonymized in this presentation for privacy. Italian law provides alternatives to detention, but in practice, many minors, particularly if foreigners, end up in prison when they commit crimes. This is a fact. Statistics show. For those who lack a family in the country, as an accompanied minors or a protective social environment that can grant other forms of control, prison is still the main security measure, which ends up reinforcing social and racial discrimination. On the contrary, at Beccaria, theater allows all inmates to leave the traveled paths behind. And as one of them once said, again, the names are anonymized, here it doesn't feel like prison, here it feels like a family. This testimony reminds us that theater creates not only performances, but also communities of care and belonging, even beyond the prison walls. Readapting the widely quoted definition of care in the Jean Pronto, I would say that theater and digital can help repair and constantly build the conditions for the inmates to maintain and continue the web of bodies, cells, and environments so that they can learn a way to enter and live in a shared world as well as possible. Ad Istituto Penale Minorile Cesare Beccaria, the Punto Zero company, directed by Giuseppe Sudellani Amazzoni, has involved inmates, volunteers, actors, and even former inmates for more than 25 years. However, what makes Punto Zero unique is its integration of digital tools into theater making. This outcome also comes with the creation of the first and only theater hall in Europe, having a door that opens directly to the outside world. This means that citizens can attend performances without passing through prison checkpoints, while the inmates come from the inside. As a matter of fact, the Punto Zero company is a theater of a prison, not in the prison. In prison, the inmates live in a timeless bubble, in a space with no identity, a non-lieu, where every action is heterodetermined and carries another meaning at its core, being expelled into a zone external to the world and to ordinary people to which the prisoners no longer belong. Their bodies become invisible, and when exposed, are weighted down by judging gaze that ends up stripping them of their individuality. The prisoner is a number, the specimen of a typology to be defended against or kept apart. Moreover, the body that renders the prisoner invisible to the outside world is re-established within the prison walls through rituals of control, surveillance, and self-exposure. The limitations therefore contribute to constructing an identity based on the very condition of exclusion and submission. As Foucault reminds us, systematic control creates subjugated outside bodies. On the contrary, in the theater hall and on stage, the body regains meaning and agency. As an actor in prison once wrote, speaking of the activity in the theater hall, to be in another place is to be another thing. So when you are in another place, even your body, your mind, your thoughts transform. End of quotation. In fact, theater works precisely on the elements of domestication of the body and therefore challenges this dehumanization. For adolescents, whose identities are still forming, this is crucial. It allows them to negotiate who they are, to ask, like Alice in Wonderland, who am I? And to go beyond the asymmetrical binary relations between prisoner, educator, prisoner, guard, or prisoner, director. Even though I speak of young inmates, I embrace the paradox of Lorenz and Young's suggestion that adolescence should not only be seen as the age of crisis, but as the age of orientation and project. Therefore, the possibility of being other through theater as practice and as a place of alternative to the cell is the premise for building a life project, stepping beyond stigma and embodying a new identity. Likewise, digital and artistic experiments must be situated within this pedagogical path as a means to bridge the digital divide between retained youth and their peers outside and offer training and professional perspectives. The Punto Zero company works both inside the prison and in the theater hall I just showed, that's there. Inside, the constraints of the prison device remain very strong in the management of access, external control, and scheduling. In the theater, almost everything changes: time, space, symbols, and consequently, relationships. For inmates, entering a hall also means going to a workplace. In fact, they are paid for rehearsals and performances with a ticket's income. In the theater, it has also been possible to invest in technical and technological equipment. Thanks to external funding and sponsoring, this space is fully equipped with professional lighting, video mapping, 3D printers, audio mixers, and virtual reality headsets, etc. The initiative to go digital also emerged as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, when online accessibility and remote engagement became essential. Performances were live streamed through ticketed access, enabling audiences to watch from home. Experiments also included 360-degree cameras, allowing remote viewers to shift perspective during rehearsals as if virtually present within the scene. This opened the way for a new model of hybrid theater, simultaneously physical and digital. The training in sound, video, and multimedia production starting in 2021. That same year, Punto Zero also produced the play New Wild Web, The Web is Cyber Rolling, an interactive multimedia performance about the potential and risks of new communication tools. It was also streamed live and broadcast on social media. However, the most advanced experimentation so far has been the production of Alice Lamented in 2025, subtitled A Journey into the Wonder of Technology and Inclusion. The play combines Alice in Wonderland with virtual reality and augmented reality, created together with young inmates. For them, Alice's journey was a metaphor for their own, learning to navigate obstacles with curiosity and resilience, transforming confinement into imagination. The Alice imagined by Lewis Carroll is a figure in motion whose strange double life on Earth and in the land of dreams highlights the idea of escape to a land where things are not terribly fixed in eternal appropriateness. Just as Alice resists the pressures of rational thought, so imprisoned actors resist the alienation of confinement in their lives. Alice also teaches the function of theater, to imagine the worlds and to stage new characters, a practice useful in life as well. The actors and technicians play before rehearsals, improvising, experimenting with new languages and the digital, returning to childhood. And the digital turns into a new playground, a dynamic environment contrasting the rigid regulations. I will not go through the various innovations because we don't have time. As I mentioned, there's video mapping, you see some images. They use the Oculus headsets, which also help them bridge the inside and the outside of the prison. But beyond its artistic dimension, the project trained young participants in advanced multimedia technologies. Skills developed through video mapping, immersive sound, and virtual reality were transferable to professional contests, such as concerts and major theater productions. Some inmates have already been engaged in paid technical internships, including preparation for the 2026 Winter Olympics in Milan. They shed their prisoner skill to become experts through the creative means of theater and digital technologies. In conclusion, the Punto Zero company demonstrates that digital technologies can enrich rather than diminish the theatrical experience. Yet, their aesthetic relevance must go hand in hand with their ethics that requires the means to adapt to the community from a pedagogically situated and pragmatic perspective. If the digital tools are not aimed at reinforcing surveillance, as in the panoptic model described by Foucault, they can become instruments of care, creativity, and professional growth in tandem with theater by building relationships and envisioning futures beyond deviance through the acquisition of empowering skills. Thus, humanity is restored where it is denied, and the objectifying gaze on the inmates is challenged. They are artists and technical experts presenting themselves through their work. And perhaps, as I was able to witness during my performance, in the astonished eyes of children watching us animated from the audience, we can glimpse the most important outcome, the overturning of the overjudging gaze. And for these young models searching for a new place in this world, a future built not on fear or stigma, but on creativity, skills, and regained hope. Thank you.
So let's have our last speaker from Yemen. He is a researcher, writer, and musician. They work on play, new media, and art and popular culture serves as a basis for narrative essays and audio stories in which personal experiences are interlinked with the construction of historical moments or culture events. In the spring of 2025, Brown's podcast on the Dutch involvement in the Afghanistan war was released by Dutch National Radio. Brown teaches at the Leiden University Center for the Art in Society. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I apologize in advance for the image I'll be screening, but I hope that most of you will know the image already. And as you do, and you probably know the image, it's been widely circulated in the past few weeks, and I hope that it's okay that I use this in a space of learning to critically examine it. So as you know, as many of you will know, I imagine last week Donald Trump posted this image on his True Social account, and it depicts him squatting down, his forearms resting on his knees and wearing an army uniform, a Stetson cavalry hat, I'll retrieve that later, and Ray-Ban pilot sunglasses. And on the right side of the image, you see 5 Bell UE-1 New York helicopters, or UEs as they were called in the Vietnam War, approaching and ostensibly returning from a mission that, from judging from the skyline as background, seems to be Chicago. And the caption makes that really clear. Now, the caption ahead makes little sense in itself because, what would a synesthetics of smell, interpretation, gestures, and words? But if you might argue that the synesthetics part of it received an explosive meaning when relating it to the intertext, what would take place, and that's Lieutenant Kilgore's statement in Apocalypse Now, that he, quote, loves the smell of napalm in the morning. So this is from Francis Ford Coppola's classic Vietnam War movie, Apocalypse Now, from 1979. And by mapping the ongoing deportations and camps of prisoners of people in the United States onto the homicidal use of napalm in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s by the US military, Donald Trump actively describes and willingly describes the fascist regime, his fascist regime, and a much longer history of imperialism and colonial and fascist violence. So in the scene reference, Lieutenant Kilgore, played by Robert Duvall, takes a squadron of US soldiers to brutally bomb and slaughter a Vietnamese coastal village. So just for my reference, how many of you have seen Apocalypse Now? I think that's most of them. most of you have been reiterating a few points of that just briefly. So starting from this image, you can imagine that there are at least three avenues that we could explore. So the first one would be the detailed iconographic analysis of the image itself and the intertext. The second one would be the use of AI-generated images on the far right, which seems to be happening a lot. And a third one would be the aesthetics of these images and how they may or may not relate to a longer tradition of fascist aesthetics of previous fascist regimes. And as you might imagine, these three aspects, these three avenues would need to be complemented and would need to be integrated in order to really develop an analysis that does justice to what's going on here. But for my expose today, also in the interest of time, I will need to be brief. I will look into the question of fascist aesthetics in digital times, mostly to sort of preface this, to move us towards the question, what would a non-fascist digital form of Kara look like, or digital aesthetics of Kara look like? So here's the thing, in the 1920s and 30s, there was an aesthetics that emerged that was closely associated with fascist politics. For example, analyzing the work of Lady Riefenstahl, whose most famous film is perhaps Triumph of the Students from 1935, a documentary about the Nazi Party. Susan Sontag observes that the aesthetics of fascism combined to, quote, rendering the movement in grandiose and rigid patterns with, quote again, celebration of the primitive. And the aesthetics of fascism in that sense seems to be closely aligned with what a number of scholars of fascism identify as its embrace as fascists' embrace of both advanced technology and a return to fictitious primordial origins or roots. So fascism in the 1930s advocated an aesthetics of steel romanticism, Stahlachers romantique, as Joseph Goebbels called it, or as fascism scholar Enzo Traverso describes it, it aimed towards aesthetics that would, quote, unite the beauty of the German forests with the industrial strength of Krupp's factories. The thing is that if we look at these kind of images that we're seeing today on the far right, which I would call fascist aesthetics, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing these kind of monumental things immediately. What we're seeing instead is AI-generated images that are deeply embedded within meme culture. They are playful, and I don't mean that in a positive sense. It's dark play. It's a kind of play that plays all Aaron Trammell has shown us to be deeply embedded within the global parameters of our understanding of play. But it is playful in a dark way. It's playful and violent. It is really embedded within meme culture, but it doesn't seem to have that monumental in it. So is this a fascist aesthetics, or how does it connect to a longer tradition of fascist aesthetics? That's really a question I think that we need to think about when we're looking at how extreme parties of the extreme right are using aesthetics today. So first off, very brief aside, you can see research has shown that particularly on the far right, during campaigns, a lot of AI images are being used. And I'm giving you two examples. One of them is from Javier Milei from Argentina on the left, and the other one is from Geert Wilders, a extreme right politician in the Netherlands for his current campaign. Both of these images are AI generated and depict a racially based and based in racism and gender normative future advocating their particular campaign plans. But we don't particularly see the fascist aesthetics that we used to see in the 1930s. So my argument today is that the combination of monumentalism and primitivism in itself is not at the core of fascist aesthetics. There's something else there, I think, something deeper seated. And I want to take my lead from something that Walter Benjamin wrote in the second version of his essay on the artwork in the age of mechanical reproducibility. And I'm sorry that I can't really explain it too much, but he argues that the aesthetic of fascism ultimately, and I quote, culminates in one point. That one point is war. So I would add that this is a war including violence that turns upon itself, turns on its own body politics, organized through an accelerated process of uttering certain groups, and then annihilating them and their forms of life, often based around gender and race, but not exclusively. So to understand how this is happening in the image posted by Donald Trump here, let me briefly turn to the analysis of the intertext, Apocalypse Now. So just hours after Trump published this text, published this meme or this AI-generated image, a lot of commentators argued that Trump clearly misunderstood Apocalypse Now. For example, Ryan T. Beckwith on NBC, senior editor for NBC, argued that this is once more evidence of an epidemic of misreading on the right. Well, I don't think this is the case. So T. Beckwith argues that clearly you're not supposed to cheer when Kilgore says, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." So clearly cheering, Trump has misunderstood that. I'm not so sure that's the case, because Apocalypse Now, the way I read it, it's not just simply a film about the Vietnam War. Like most Coppola films, it's a deeply allegorical film. So what happens in that film is that Captain Benjamin L. Willard, who's played by Martin Sheen, he's given the assignment to track down the legendary, but infamous American Colonel Walter Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando. So once a revered member of the U.S. military and war effort in Vietnam, Kurtz has gone rogue. He's traveled into the jungle, set up camp in Cambodia, where he has, as the film has it, descended into primitive madness, and has assembled a crew of indigenous people and deserted soldiers who are now waging a brutal war of atrocity against the Viet Cong and Khmer Rouge. So Willard is then ordered to travel up the New River with a small native patrol boat, and he must track down Kurtz and terminate his commands. Now, the way I read it, Willard's journey up the river is a journey back in time, to times immemorial, if you will, and to the primordial heart and origins of violence. And in that sense, the narrative, quite problematically I would say, follows the deeply colonial narrative and mindset of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, on which that narrative called Apocalypse Now is premised. So, what's the importance of this in the case of Kurtz is that Kurtz stands both at the origin or at the end and at the beginning of war and violence. So he's at one and the same time an esteemed leader, or was an esteemed leader in the most technologically advanced military technological apparatus of war in the world at the time, and still today, the American military. And he's a person who's descended back into a supposedly primordial instinctive rush towards horrific violence. And the speech that Kurtz makes towards the end of that film provides a good indication of how that goes. Kurtz concludes that in order to truly wage war, you must have men who are moral, and at the same time are able to utilize their primordial instinct to kill without feeling, without passion, without judgment. That's what he says in the final scene, what Brando says in the final scene. So for Kurtz, his descent into the jungle is not a descent into madness. Instead, he has reconnected with the primordial instinct of violence that for him is at the very core of human life, humans as a form of life, and perhaps even to all forms of life. Now, that interconnection between the primordial origin of violence and the technologically advanced and vanguard presence of violence in the technological military of the US, or actually this circular narrative in which the violence of technologically advanced and ubiquitous warfare is folded back into primordial origins. So the violence of war that we see here, traveling on that river, connected by Kurtz, that's not just a reflection on the nature of war. It's really a legitimation and even a spiritual reverence of violence and war, with the aim of pushing it further into the future. And that, I want to argue, that is really what is essential to fascism, and that's the roots of fascist aesthetics. And this is really, I think, also what underlines that combination of the German forest and the industrialism that Enter prefers to identify in the fascist aesthetics, rather than monumentalism or something like that. So, I now go to the final slide. So, Lieutenant Kilgore appears in the middle of Apocalypse Now. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he appears in the middle. He stands right in front, he stands sort of in the middle of the technologically advanced military violence and the primordial violence that are being connected. And I have to say, it's really to credit the costume designer Eiko Aishioka, who did the costumes for Apocalypse Now, that she had the wits to reference several traces of American secular colonialism. So the Stetson cavalry, for example, that wasn't at the 1960s as well. It wasn't any longer a part of the military dress code. But it was part of the dress code of the American cavalry in the 1860s when they traveled west, the so-called Western frontier, and as a result of that, also engaged in an ethnic cleansing and genocide of indigenous people like Navajo. So, in that sense, what Trump is doing here, I think, with these kind of images, is really inscribing himself into that and subscribing to that concept of violence that I think lies at the core of fascism, both technologically advanced and primitive at the same time. So by way of conclusion, I want to offer two thoughts. First, in order to think carefully and coherently about what a non-fascist carrying aesthetic would involve, we must understand the aesthetics of fascism that has a strong presence, I think, in the digital realm and is actively shaping our world and the violence within it. And second, to grasp the full extent of harm that these fascist digital aesthetics does, we will need to have a precise understanding of the post-digital, that is to say, the way these digital points of information continuously enmesh with the non-digital world and collectively build up our world today. And we'll need to find ways to sort of undo that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bram. Also, for you for this beautiful and insightful presentations, which gave us a really new perspectives and different approach in digital care and democratic gestures. So I don't think we have plenty of time for the questions. So please, somebody wants to start with the question?
Thank you all so much. My question is for Bram. I'm thinking a lot about camp in fascist aesthetics and the images that you showed, especially thinking about artificial intelligence. There is an element of, as you say, this dark playfulness, and I think that there's a kind of strategical move that makes, where even as you showed the slides, I noticed some of the audience chuckled, and there is a kind of like response to campy aesthetics that makes us laugh. And I wondered if you could say something about the way in which AI sort of integrated into this fascist aesthetic makes it difficult to organize a kind of critique around it. As you said, it's kind of like we can intellectualize it as being wrong or an incorrect reading of the past, but for those who follow and admire Trump and other figures like him, the correctness of the reading matters less than the way in which they can operationalize the image to their own ends. So I wonder your thoughts about how artificial intelligence and the ability to generate these images that are clearly unreal, but yet real in their messaging, how that can be so effective. Thank you.
I think that's a really important question. I don't really want to claim to have a good answer to that, but let me just basically reiterate some of the points that I think you made that are really valid. One of them indeed is that when you look at this kind of images, there's a certain playfulness to it, and it is funny, but it's funny in the following sense. In the Parallax View, this 1970s film, at a certain point, Warren Beatty forgot the name of the character. He walks up to his editor and he gives him a pitch, and the editor says, "Listen, I'm laughing, but I don't think it's funny." I think a lot of it is, I think it's understandable that we're laughing. I don't think any of us thinks it's funny at all, but it's really, I think in terms of affect and emotions and sentiments, I think it's relevant to really closely think about what happens when you're laughing but you don't think it's funny. Because when you're laughing, that does mean that it draws your attention. And without going into it very deeply, it's a sort of a broad sweeping statement, but basically I think a real challenge here is that the algorithms that were crafted to design social media platforms on which these images circulate, these thrive really well on this kind of engagement where we're laughing even if we don't think it's funny. It's terribly hurtful, it's dark, well, it has all of the staples, I won't go into too much, but it circulates wildly, and I think most of us have seen it because we engage with it whether we want it or not. And that's a very deep issue, and I think Barbara's question about how can we construct platforms and environments, digital environments, where we work with different forms of engagement that I think is really the challenge. If we want to undermine these kind of images, we'll need different platforms, different ways of engagements on these different forms of engagement. So I'm not sure if you want to speak about that, Barbara.
I was actually thinking, from this image I was also thinking about the body position, because this kind of squatting position that Trump or whoever this character is much different than the standing one, and there's no doubt that there is something also ethical about it, so that the very erect, very realistic figure has a sort of standing position, and the squatting one is more like animal or more female related, or something that is more like grounded. So maybe there's also kind of a response to the camp, or kind of hybrid, and it's true that generally AI is really capable of producing queer images that are really like hybrid and latent, and so that's interesting. But it's true that I think that in this kind of situation we are still in a sort of a spectacle, let's say, and what I was kind of more thinking about is more of the experiences of engagement and relationships that are not something that we look at, but is something that we do. And that kind of shift, it is an aesthetic shift, but it also is an ethical shift, because when we are looking at something as a spectacle or as a symbolic image, I'm not saying that we are passive, because we're not completely passive, but somehow we are not engaging in the same manner as when we are also, in a sense, co-creating or participating into the fabrication of the thing. But I was also interested about, because we kind of co-created and thought about the sequence of this panel, right? And so it was about violence, or feminism, violence, and kind of care and artistic relations, and going back to a more historical and symbolic way. And I was interested also about what Ram was saying, is that what will be the imagery of care look like? And it's always the same kind of problem, is that we think that we can actually understand care as something that violence is not, as a sort of antagonism to this patriarchal, very dominant and oppressive world. But I kind of think, I think that it does require a completely other framework. We cannot just imagine something that is the opposite of what we are represented with. It is something that is not counter something. It is about the care, the violence that the neurodivergent and they can also produce, because I think that is also something important.
I think that what's important what was said for me was the refrain that the child is not the opposite of violence, but we can use the same tools to create, to co-create, to create another frame to communication and to images and to, maybe I will stop.
And the problem with this, because I think that there is many people who look at this and they laugh and they find it funny. How do you deal with that? I mean, I also see, like, ideologically I'm against it, but I see why this is funny, and I'm also wondering if, like, the humor is not like totally new element in fascist aesthetic.
No, well, I think I can agree with that. I think you're right. I think through that kind of humor, and as Barbara also pointed out, this deep intertechnical layered intertextual, not necessarily deep in any meaningful sense, but this saturation of intertext and playing on intertext and the presumed humorousness. That is what grabs our attention. That's what makes it circulate. I think these images always work because they circulate. I mean, the quality of them is rubbish, but they circulate widely, so they're sort of network images. And this is how they constitute the world, a worldview and understanding of the world where they keep circulating a fascist mindset, also always relating being human to violence, which I don't buy into that premise. So you're right, I was maybe circumventing that, but no, you're right, I think that's the deeply problematic issue, and I don't have an answer to how to counter that, I have to be honest about that.
Just a quick comment on one problem when we sort of like laugh at this, even if it's not funny, is that it's a way to desensitize us from this tragedy from fascism. And I just want to also say how the word that you use here in this platform of care is very interesting, because there's to care for, and then there is to take care.
Maybe say something about, I don't know about the others, maybe you can say something also about what we mean by care. I mean, there's ethics of care, of course, is, let's say, a way the sociologists and ethics, in ethics, justice has been rethought. But what I actually think that is important to understand in care, it is that it is an appreciation and an aesthetic and ethical evaluation, because there's also the idea that what do we care about and what actually matters to me or to others, etc. It is a relationship of care. And there certainly is implicitly something that is excluded, because you can't care in the same way, the same or different type of things. So taking care of somebody is also, or something, is also a way or to evaluate that thing as saying this matters to me. And then there is the care receiving, which could also happen through fiction. For example, we can be in a sort of relationship of care, or thinking that some fictional characters can soothe or make us feel as if our feelings matter, because there is a sort of identification, etc., with the character. So, for example, we can have an affected relationship with some TV series character, because this character comes regularly also in our lives. It's not the same thing in films. So there is something, let's say, specific to care that has also to do with maintaining a relationship and maintaining also alive something. That could also be, going back to Yuriko Saito, cleaning something is a way to take care of it without it being something that we explicitly say it is ethical. But
yeah, maybe I don't understand it. You're always referring to it as if someone is caring for someone else, and I'd like to bring it to a more social and community aspect. And consider care in public sphere. Does that change its meaning completely, and changes the images of care too, and relate to? I mean, let's go back to ancient Greece, when Antigone did what she did, she made it public, and that became an act of disobedience. It was an act of care. The fact of being public made it an act of disobedience, but still it was care. And we know what's built on the image of myth of Antigone, going back to the fact that it's not just about being humanitarian. to communities and with solidarities and networks. And by networks, I mean also how these spaces related are political and can have a meaning that goes beyond the individual. And I think that is the great divide in order to make this shift.
Also about that self-care can be in opposition to care. Then think about the, for example, call-outs and call-outs, public call-outs, when there is a risk. Some people do this because they care about environment and about other people who can be in the same violent situation because they don't make a call out. But it is opposite to self-care because it's a big risk. And as I said, in many situations, call outs start violence in the social media and in the public discussion, and the dynamic of this violence is very difficult to imagine when you start, but at the same time sometimes it's worth to do this. And only one point, I would say something about the images and neurodiversity, because we should also think about this, that some images and memes and such images are very tough to understand for neurodivergent person, and it's something like, okay, everyone is alive. Sorry. I finished.
This is kind of a follow-up to the idea of AI slop being camp, because I think in some ways I disagree in the sense that it kind of lacks this filthy John Waters-esque depravity. Like, where's the dirt on Donald Trump's arms in this image is kind of my question. So following those lines, I was thinking very much of futurism being this mechanical supremacy, this fascistic idea that acts as a genesis or a cleanser that then allows people in this idea to return to the nostalgic of the natural. But both are still very focused on the clean, and they lack that idea of filth. You know, Berlin Olympics and dances coming out of Wannsee Island that both connected to like the German forest, but they're very much about perfection and symmetry in nature, whereas futurism is about this domination over nature, and it's still this idea of mechanical precision and supremacy. So I was wondering if any of the theories on the unclean, such as like Jack Halberstam's wildness or the disorderly, Bataille's theories around waste, if any of those ideas make their way into some of the aesthetic theories you're talking about, not just when it comes to the aesthetics of fascism, but also especially when we're talking about like what it is to be in a prison or making art out of a prison, which is specifically an infrastructure that, you know, supposedly cleans society of people within a prison. What does it mean to then have this permeability of a prison space? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if I totally got your question, if it's about clean space or cleaning the space. I think cleaning the space is what happens when these people actually put it away from a permeable space, making it permeable so that they are not, and they are the dirt, they represent the dirt, they're not simply living in dirt spaces. That's how society represents them. I mean, stained. And the point is how to remove the stain from their face, in the face of society. And so I think the thing is it's not about them relying somehow on, well, of course, certainly not on theories, but in practices that somehow problematize or consider this experience, but how society has sustained and certain parts of population in history, not just for people who are in prison, and how by building a different image that somehow totally denies that image and that history, it is possible to build something which is totally unrelated to it. So I think it's a process of denial and reconstruction of something quite different. In this case, it is clearly mostly based on surrealistic, I would say, imaginary. Because in this way, you remove what is the real in the everyday, build a different reality with different time, space, and symbols, and be able to bring the other ones who come to look at you and somehow push them a different level. If they stayed, and some people did, and actually when you go and see something in prison, except for this case, usually you actually go through the checkpoints. It's kind of exotic. You're going to see the exotic, and you want to see the dirt, because that's what you imagine prison to be like. But this is not. This is exactly what, by doing art in these places, you're trying to deny, and by showing it in the public, and particularly using also the digital, which allows you to bring it also very far from the prison. We try to do it. I don't know if I actually answered your questions.
I won't be able to answer your question here, but I think it's a really relevant point. And just as an aside, it also is to illustrate the wealth of knowledge that is out there that we can learn from. I want to gesture, or I want to refer to a different author, thinker, philosopher than the ones you've already mentioned, and that's George Clinton. George Clinton in 1973, with his Funkadelic Collective, put out an album called The Cosmic Slav. And I think it's worthwhile, I personally think it's worthwhile looking into that collective that Clinton said. It's the video of Cosmic Slav has a wild group of people of all different walks of life and experiences, lived experiences, walking out of a dark tunnel and moving into Grand Central Park and dancing around the fountain. I think the rhythm of Clinton, text as well, the idea of Cosmic Slav not as a negative thing, but Slav as something that can create a community that can connect. I think that can position a different concept of Slav, and I know it's not the same as the AI Slav critique that we're having, but I think there is a potential there, a wealth of knowledge that we've ignored in popular culture, certainly in Clinton and hip-hop and whatnot, that continue through that works with that I think is valuable, and we can use that in a respectful way. We can use that to think through different ways of living.
Thank you so much for this very panel. A question for Brown. AI generated images of many of today's fascist, populist politicians seem to be based on two photo-based references. Blockbuster, violent movies, superheroes, cops, war, and the ideal life ads. Images of several, not all, but several left-leaning politicians, at least until the first 10 years of this century. Thinking about Obama's Hope poster, for example, tend to get inspiration from traditional illustrated socialist or communist posters. Do you think those aesthetic references are set, or could we see an overlap? For example, if one or the other becomes more successful, more effective?
Honestly, I think a great question. I don't really know, if I'm honest. I feel really uncomfortable to make a judgment or prediction about that. No, I don't think I have the necessary expertise or historical knowledge of left-wing kind of iconographic uses to really say something about how that history is particularly developed. And really I don't feel I should be making predictions of which of these would be more successful But I will say that, to the best of my impression, mostly having looked into what the iconography of extreme right images is doing, that these seem to circulate really well on social media. And that's not saying that they'll be more successful, but I think with the kind of algorithms and how they allow one to circulate certain content or not, I think that those images, as long as these algorithms remain in place, will be more successful. I don't think it's about the strong element of the iconography. I think it's about what gets circulated on these platforms, what is allowed to circulate. But again, I don't think I have the necessary expertise to say this in a very firm way.
Greetings. Thank you for your presentations. Barbara, yes, just an unfamiliarity with a particular term, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on it or speak to how you mobilize it within your body of work, and it's techno-optimism and mastery. So, techno-optimism and mastery. It was on the slide with Andrew Tidd, and I was just not familiar with the term techno-optimism and mastery. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
No, it's not really like a term. It's what I meant by that maybe we could also, if on one side we should be critical on how, especially not just what we see, but also what is behind, and critical of how the infrastructure functions. But maybe we could also be optimistic about the technology. That's what I meant by techno-optimism. Just to, that maybe it's really simple and maybe it doesn't exist, but it was the idea that there is maybe something that we can take in a more optimistic way about this technology if we consider them as neutral in a sense, or we will use them in a way that it will go intentionally towards something that is exactly the opposite of what the infrastructure would like us to use them. So it is also kind of related to, I don't know how you say this in English, like détournement, like an artistic gesture of taking one thing and one object and using it in another way that is not the way that the object is supposed to be used. And I think that it is very simple, but it is a practical overturn of the kind of normalization of how we use technology. So it's really being optimistic.
And to the third presenter that you made in the beginning, so I found your work particularly interesting, just because I'm seeing it within the spaces I've occupied, where institutions have to now be a bit more agile and flexible, but there are policies and people who are quite dedicated to rules when it comes on to the adjustments that need to be made to facilitate students in particular who are neurodivergent. I'm just wondering, within your work, have you seen any institutions, in particular schools or universities, that have made these adjustments, and what might the process look like, especially considering bureaucracy and so forth?
I'm not sure that I understood everything, but I understood that you are asking about the comparing between cultural institutions and universities and the procedures. And of course, my focus is on theatre and cultural institution because I'm a theatrologist. But of course, during my research, it was a very long process. I was wondering about my environment and the university as the area of abuse of power and inclusiveness. And I think that, I don't know how it is in France, I can say about Polish institutions. I think that from 2000
many things which we didn't thought about, I don't know, 10 years ago. And now as a lecturer, we also have to think about it. We have to educate ourselves, and we have to, as a lecturer in our society, as a researcher, and also in the contact with students, that world changed. And other sensitivity is very needed. Sorry for my English. So I think that maybe we don't live in the better world, but maybe more conscious, and we still try. The same is with language and non-binary language, for example. Many of my colleagues, which are older than I, have a problem with this, but they educate themselves because they have to. Maybe they are not happy about this, but they have to. So yeah, I think that we are in the process. I don't know if I answered your question.
There is just one last question and then we will close the session.
I was very inspired by several of the talks up here, and this is going back to like several comments. But I think between the three of your examples, I'm thinking about this sort of generation of space where care can take place. So if we think about the prison, there's these ruptures have to be fabricated to allow for like possibility of imagination and the development of personal identity for the youth who are in there. And then you think about disabled individuals who need to sort of advocate, right? As you were saying, it's against the self-care. But in order to care for your community or your network or the care web, you have to go against your own well-being to create the affordance that something can change. And also, I think this comes to like the generation or taking of power in order to carve out the spaces for care that we see as sometimes successful and sometimes not. For neurodivergent individuals, for example, they can either advocate or be pushed down for this. So I guess this confluence of your three works was making me think about how we create space or like images or opportunities to support or scaffold these types of care, which also have great cost.
Thank you for your question. I think it goes somehow to the point of needing to have a space to be able to do that. But I would somehow connect this word to another, time. Oftentimes time is more than space. I'm talking about prison now. The example I showed is a very exclusive one. But I could quote a lot of other examples of theater in prison. Oftentimes theater is made in a small cell. Sometimes it's 2 cells. But what really makes the difference is the fact that the community can go inside and spend time, and that there is someone who actually takes care and cares for the community to continue going, because they need to build trust. And it's not only the trust of the people who are there, and maybe have had nothing to do with art, or sometimes they cannot read or write, and they learn it through the process of doing theater or other projects, but also the trust of the departments of justice. It is very different from one country to the other. Like in Italy, there have been some examples of theater companies that were established in 1988 and still continue. And those companies, I could tell you about names of actors who have become popular actors in movies, awarded at Cannes Festival, and which means those people changed their lives for good. And of course, they built a new image of someone who had a past, and through a process of learning, also learning, through the things they could read and experience in the relationships they built, they were able to discover it could be something else than what their prior identity was. But in order to do that, they need to have time. And that's also the time of those going in, because it's a hard work.
Time.
Time.
We have no time.
To our speakers and